the lease is that you fully furnish.
With- Okay, and start video. Okay, I think I'm there, Carolyn.
Yep, you're in.
I'll just,
Roberto, can you hear me?
I can hear you, yes.
Okay, I can hear you.
Are you in your office or at home or what?
I'm in my office.
Okay. And no sign of this famous storm yet, right?
No. No sign.
I'll mute myself for the moment.
Okay,
If you need to speak with me, just tell me to unmute.
okay.
John?
Yes.
Is there some way that I can turn off that ting thing that goes on every time someone joins us?
Uh, I don't know of a way. Hold on. Yeah, hopefully that once everyone comes on, they're not going to be um going out and in.
Okay, okay.
They can choose to turn
Yes,
the
we can
camera
ask
off.
people to mute their microphones when they're not speaking.
Right,
That avoids background noise.
right.
John, I think we can begin, right?
Yeah.
So maybe just a sec here.
Okay.
Do you hear me, John? Does everyone hear me there?
Okay. Can everyone hear me and Professor Unger? If you could all unmute yourself. And yeah, I see a lot of thumbs up, so
We can hear you, sir.
okay, thank you.
We can hear you, Professor.
Great, thanks.
Very good. So, shall I just begin, John?
Yeah, go ahead, Roberto. Unless you want, I mean, today we're going to discuss the contrast and similarities between Brazil and the United States based on a book that's not well known, but we hope that you enjoyed it. It's, we think, a foundational comparative study, Moog's, Bandeirantes, and Pioneers.
We're going to
So-
give an account which is somewhat different from Vienna Moog's, of course.
Okay,
And I'm going to do that by speaking, making a series of remarks, veering between practical, political, and economic issues and spiritual ones,
right.
stopping at each point along the way for conversation with John and with the class. So Brazil is the country in the world that is most like the United States, although this similarity is not widely acknowledged in either of the countries. Start with the basic facts of their circumstances and history. Two countries of almost identical size, one in North America, the other in South America, constituted on the same basis of European settlement and African slavery. And each of these two countries is at the extreme of their respective types with respect to inequality. The United States is by far the most unequal of the rich industrial countries of the North Atlantic world. And Brazil is among the most unequal of the developing countries, and in fact, one of the most unequal societies in the history of humanity. And in both these countries are very religious. We've discussed the religiosity of the Americans. Brazil is also one of the most religious societies in the world. The Catholic majority, on the whole, has a less intense faith than the large evangelical minority that we have of tens of millions of Brazilians, maybe 60 or 70 million, almost a third of the nation. And in these two societies, despite their vast inequalities and exclusions, the majority of ordinary men and women still seem to believe that everything is possible. The orientation to the future, the great theme of futurity, is one of the common elements between these societies. There are, of course, many differences that I will remark on during class today. And one of the differences has to do with mental colonialism. So the Americans believe that if there are good institutions, economic or political institutions, it is they who invented them. And the rest of humanity must either subscribe to the formula of a free society, which they discovered at the time of the foundation of their republic, or continue to languish in poverty and despotism. We have in Brazil a very inventive and vital popular culture, a culture of the masses, but the political and economic culture of the elites is derivative. And one of the themes of Brazilian history has been the importation of our economic and especially our political institutions from the countries that we take as guides, the rich powerful and successful countries of the North Atlantic world. That must be one of the reasons why our institutions, like borrowed clothes, don't fit us. And we'll have occasion to remark on that in the class today. So let me stop right there with these preliminaries and ask you, John, whether you want to remark on any of this right at the outset.
Yeah, so I guess I would highlight that the differences in Brazil and the United States. And one, that the United States has been predominantly a Protestant nation, and Brazil much more Catholic. The Puritans, the United States was settled by Europeans who came to North America not to search for gold and silver mines and then return, but to settle permanently.
Yeah.
So that's something that's I mean, I would love to hear what you say about the significance
Well,
of,
that's the question of the nation and the idea of the nation.
yes.
What promotes it and impedes it in these two countries. And I do say a word about that in my next set of remarks.
Okay. So yeah, I'm jumping.
Going back to the question of religion, which you mentioned.
Yes.
We now have in our country, as I mentioned, this large evangelical minority. It's
Okay.
a minority.
And how long has it? When did the evangelical minority?
It has only really achieved a larger dimension of importance, quantitative and spiritual importance in the last few decades.
Okay.
Certainly, from say 1970 on, where it achieved this prominence. And it is a striking feature of Brazilian life, because it's as if we now had in our country a Trojan horse, a very large minority with spiritual ideas and ideological orientations that contrast with the predominant orientations in Brazilian history and map very closely the form of religiosity that prevails in what Harold Bloom called the American religion. Not Orthodox Christianity, Catholic or Protestant. Not its secularization in the secular humanism, but the religions that the Americans invented, like Jehovah's Witnesses and Seventh-day Adventists and Latter-day Saints, all of which have been imported into Brazil and have a prominent place in this evangelical world.
Interesting. And this again has been
it's not just religion. As will have occasion to comment, we have had a qualitative involution of our productive system, a deindustrialization. So agriculture and ranching and mining are now the predominant economic activities. And in the world of the agro, there's a whole social system around country music, rodeos, and a series of features which are, of course, characteristic of American life and not of Brazilian life. And that's why I mentioned that this idea of a Trojan horse, like an alien part of Brazil, which is nevertheless taken over by Brazil and becomes Brazilian. And this is the distinctive form that is taken in Brazil by a worldwide phenomenon on which I remarked in an earlier class. The worldwide phenomenon is that in the most populous countries of the world, the majority of people remain disorganized and poor, but their horizon of aspiration, rather than being proletarian, is petty bourgeois. Most of them are not actually members of a small business class, but they aspire to the conventional expressions of petty bourgeois life. The
Similar
dream
to,
of
similar
a
to,
small farm,
right,
a store, or a technical service paid for by a fee.
right,
Uh, that's the dream of the majority in Brazil, as in much of the world. In Brazil, this subjective petty bourgeoisie, it's not an objective petty bourgeoisie because it's not a small business class, in great numbers, has also a religious expression and is associated with this Brazilian evangelical movement.
okay, okay. Okay,
And with a whole culture and form of consciousness of initiative and self-help,
right,
expressed and reinforced, of course, in the language of a certain Protestant theology.
right, right. So that resembles,
With all of its with all of its paradoxes. Like
yes,
on the one hand, the theology of predestination, the Calvinist theme, but
right,
on the other hand, the incitement to hyperactivity
right,
and self-help and self-salvation.
right, right, right,
In belief, salvation on the basis of divine grace, but in action through self-help.
right, right. So it's a,
So that's all by way just of introducing the great theme of this contrast. Now, the contrast was better understood, don't you think, John, in earlier periods of American history than now?
yes, much
In the
more.
19th century, it was common in the United States to think that members of the American elite during their youth should have a period of traveling in Brazil, because Brazil was like the other
Yes,
side of the moon, right?
yes,
People
yes,
like, say, William James.
yes,
Uh,
yes,
and we know that Teddy Roosevelt, when he was defeated in his bid for re-election, of election to the presidency for the second time, went to Brazil, spent years there,
right,
the Amazon with one of our great explorers, and almost died there.
right,
So
right,
these were common experiences then, but then Brazil disappeared and disappeared into the morass of the third world,
right,
lost its particular significance for the United States.
right,
And that takes me then to my second theme, which is the nation and the
right,
idea of the nation in Brazil. So many circumstances conspire in Brazil against national self-consciousness. One of them is the one emphasized by Viana Moog in the book that you read,
right,
with this predatory relation to the country. That
yes,
is the idea that they were there to discover wealth and then to bring it back to Europe, and that there was no intimate and permanent connection with the country, that the
that's right,
country was not recognized as the site of a new life
that's
that they
right,
would have, but
right,
simply as a stage in their adventure of self-promotion in Europe.
right,
So that was one great obstacle. And in fact, in Brazilian history, there have been these cycles or around commodities, first wood, then gold, then diamonds, then rubber,
right,
one after the other, drawing attention away from the construction of the nation to the search for these easy riches.
right, right,
A second inhibition to the idea of the nation has, of course, been the severity of the class system and its combination with race. But of course,
right,
that also exists in the United States.
right,
Uh, a third has been the mental colonialism on which I remarked,
right,
that the ideas through which the Brazilians understand themselves, at least at the level of elite culture, are for the most part not their own ideas, but the ideas that they have imported from these rich countries.
right, right,
And I think that a fourth and unremarked reason for the weakness of the national idea in Brazil is that we haven't had wars. Our last great war was the terrible war, the genocidal war that Brazil, together with Argentina and Uruguay, waged against Paraguay.
Right.
From 1865 to 1870, and which was the most terrible war of the 19th century, even worse than the American Civil War, and resulted in the death of something like 2/3 of the male population of Paraguay.
Wow.
So this was a really terrible war. But since then, we have had no major wars. We symbolically joined the Second World War toward the end.
Right.
So the experience in the United States, like that of the ancient Romans, is that the elites participated in the wars of the Americans.
Right.
And as you can see in Memorial Hall, if you look at the wall,
Right.
you
Right.
see that all the major families of the American elite sent their sons to fight and die in the war.
Yes.
So the idea of the nation was sealed in blood. Now, we have no such experience.
That's true.
And that is a profound source of the weakening of the national idea in Brazil.
Yes. Yes.
Nevertheless, Brazil has become a nation. And in fact, if you take the American platitude about the melting pot that accepts the immigrants that come from abroad and submerge them in the new national identity, Brazil on the whole seems to me to be a much more successful melting pot than the United States, because the large ethnic groups that we have there, like millions of Japanese,
Right.
more Lebanese than there are in Lebanon,
Wow.
don't associate themselves with their national religions. They think of themselves exclusively as Brazilians, even when there are physical traits which distinguish them from the other Brazilians.
Mm-hmm.
So why has Brazil, despite all of these inhibitions that I described, discovered and affirmed the idea of the nation in such a dramatic way? So the conventional historical explanations of this are, among others, two. The first is that the Portuguese crown, unlike the Spanish crown, kept its great South American colony together and didn't permit that they would be separated into separate centers of power.
Right.
And another kind of explanation is that Brazilian popular culture has transcended the regional variations. The popular music and the telenovela are heard throughout Brazil. So these are the explanations that are given. I have to say that I don't find them convincing. And they have the character of many historical explanations, the explanations preferred by historians, that they're like just so stories. They're ex post rational explanations that appear to give a veneer of naturalness to the surprises of history. I think that Brazil as a nation is a project of the Brazilian people, and that for mysterious reasons, the Brazilian people decided to make Brazil a nation. And the project is their project. And generally in the world, nationalism is a project of the elites, promoted aggressively by the elites.
Right.
It was never promoted aggressively by the Brazilian elites. It was promoted by the Brazilian masses against the elites. And this has given a very different character to Brazilian nationalism.
Right. Right. And how recently has this occurred?
Well,
When did
because all of these inhibitions that I described a few moments ago are long-standing inhibitions. Inhibitions to the national idea. From the very outset, the Brazilians, in large part African slaves,
Uh-huh.
then a mixed race, because miscegenation, as I will say, was one of the dominant characteristics of Brazilian life.
Right.
The majority of the Brazilians, they have wanted Brazil to become a nation, a community of faith. Why they have wanted is, as I say, mysterious. And unlike the historians who have explanations for everything, I won't pretend to explain it.
So what would be your interpretation?
My interpretation is this profound desire in Brazil to be together and to form this nation against the elites, because the idea of the elites has been that we import our institutions, our doctrines, our ideas,
Right.
And Brazilian popular culture is very original and has a unique identity, but it has been affirmed against the elites.
Right.
And what I think is that the project of the nation in Brazil is a project of the masses and not a project of the elites, contrary to what it has been in most of the world.
Right.
Now, maybe someone in the class would like to make a remark about this, because we should also invite everyone to question as we go along, right, John?
Yes. Yeah. So if you have a question, raise your hand and
Or a proposition or a comment
proposition.
going in some other direction. If not, I would go on to the discussion, to the next stage, to the next set of remarks.
Okay. I just have a question if you could elaborate on the project of the masses, not the elites. And that is, was there ever a period in Brazil in the way there was in the United States where the elites and the masses united
Yes.
because of a threatening enemy that they wanted to defeat?
Well, not just an enemy. So because, as I say, Brazil hasn't had wars
Right.
since the war against Paraguay.
Right.
But our most successful moment of national development occurred around 1950, when Vargas, having been a dictator, and having sympathized as a dictator with the Axis, in 1950, as a constitutionally elected president, reinvented himself as a nationalist developmentalist and established then the basis of a powerful industrial system in Brazil, was conventional industry, what was then the vanguard of production in the whole world.
Right.
And we had a branch of conventional industry in the southeast of the country, which was one of the great industrial parks of the world.
Right.
And for several decades, that then was the motor of growth in the development of the economy. Vargas did that as a nationalist, rebelling against foreign economic intervention and presence, and through the constitution of state enterprises in heavy industry, and import substituting industrialization. And this was a project that had clear nationalist expression. So the Brazilian people, for whom the nation was always a project, then found in Vargas's industrial project an instrument or an expression of their ambitions. So that was a moment in which this diffuse popular sensibility found its expression in the policy of the state.
Interesting.
This was a state which was not itself the instrument of the Brazilian elites, who were rentiers then, as they have been rentiers almost always.
Right.
But a state which tried to establish its own constituency of an organized industrial labor force, headquartered in the capital-intensive sectors of the economy,
Uh-huh.
and a national industrial bourgeoisie associated with the state in this project of national developmentalism.
Interesting. More of a bourgeoisie then, as opposed to now?
Well, because there were national industrialists, right?
Yes.
Who associated themselves with import substituting industrialization,
Right.
with protectionism, with
Right.
a national industrial project.
Right.
This was parallel to similar events in other parts of Latin America at the time,
Okay.
to the regimes of Cardenas in Mexico and of Perón in Argentina.
Right.
But Brazil was the place where this autochthonous industrialization went furthest and reached a very high level, a quality.
Yes. Yeah, Brina, you have a question?
Oh, sorry, no.
Oh, okay.
So I go on.
Jack Burton has a raised hand. Jack, you have a question?
Yeah, hi. One of the things that struck me about this initial conversation was that you were talking about how a lot of the Brazilian culture is united around this sort of religious idea, this Protestant idea. I was wondering if you could speak to how that sort of intersects with the sort of popular culture pushing against the elite. Is there sort of a religious aspect to that as well?
It's a different kind of culture. I'll say some more about that later on, but it's a culture which is organized around the theme of self-help and initiative. So Brazilian culture has been a culture that, as I'm going to argue later, combined affect, power, and exchange, the sentimentalization of unequal exchange. The degenerate or extreme form of that is the ideology of slavery as a one big happy family.
Right.
And the opposite of that, of course, is the idea of we're autonomous agents.
Right.
A theme associated with Protestantism in the moral history of humanity, and heavily promoted by the evangelical movement in Brazil. So it's as if the political theology of the evangelical movement were a kind of liberalism for the masses. That is, it will secede from a world dominated by these patron-client relations into micro worlds, little worlds governed by the moral standards of respectability, promise-keeping, self-reliance, and so forth. That's been the political theology of Protestantism, of evangelical Protestantism in Brazil. And it has contrasted with the dominant moral tone of the society. So given that the left-leaning regimes in Brazil, the left-leaning governments, have typically proceeded by kind of social co-option, social transfers, handouts, transfer programs, the evangelical movement has on the whole been hostile to that. And they want self-reliance. They want a world in which the individuals form themselves and are not just clients of the state or beneficiaries of the state. That's been the moral tone of the evangelical movement in Brazil. It's been a rebellion against paternalism, transfers, against the attempt to turn the popular majority in Brazil into what you could call social rentiers. So the financiers, the elite, are financial rentiers, profiting from the astronomical real rate of interest. And the mass of the Brazilian people, benefited by these transfer programs, then become, in a way, social rentiers. They receive a little equivalent to the vast handouts that are given to the asset holding class. And the theological counterpart to that is this evangelical Protestantism in Brazil.
Great.
We-
Thank you so much.
Which resonates quite a bit with the United States in the
Indeed.
rise.
It more than resonates with the United States. So that's why I call this provocatively a Trojan horse. We had a piece of the United States now inside us. Huh?
Yes,
And
yes,
we have to reckon with it in some form
yes,
and use it as a source for our national project. So
yes, yes.
and as I've argued in another context, traditional archaic family business is not a promising base for a growth miracle, for a national project of development.
Correct.
And neither does it solve the problems of its own agents. So
Right.
what would be necessary would be for a dissident part of the national elite, a productivist and nationalist counter elite,
Right.
then to seize power in some way and to approach this subjective petty bourgeoisie and offer it an alternative way to realize its aspirations, to
Right.
modest prosperity and independence, a way superior to the unproductive way of isolated, archaic family business.
That's right. That's right. That's right. That's good.
Now, then, if I can go on the third set of remarks I want to make
Yes.
about a theme of an intangible theme with many tangible expressions, a theme of culture,
Right.
the theme of syncretism. What I
Right.
mean by syncretism is the idea of combining everything with everything else.
Right.
One way to describe Brazil formulaically is to say that Brazil is the country in which syncretism is both the problem and the solution. So a pervasive theme of Brazilian society and culture is the mixture of everything with everything else.
Right.
So you could say the United States and the Protestant cultures in general are the opposite.
Right.
They are cultures of division, of dialectic,
Yes.
in which not just black and white, but
In religious
and
terms,
autonomy
yeah.
or whatever. Everything
yes,
is
economic, religious, and
our
yeah.
Our theme is the mixture.
Right. Right.
And of
Right.
course, an element that reinforces the mixture is mental colonialism. Because
Right.
if the ideas by which we understand ourselves in the elite culture are not our ideas, but are ideas borrowed from a foreign reality,
Right.
they don't have an organic base in our own experience. And so the ideas then are, because they don't represent real forces, but they are a kind of relabeling exercise. The labels are imported and then pasted onto a different reality.
Mm-hmm.
That alien character of the labels then facilitates this syncretism that I'm describing.
Mm-hmm.
So the foreign doctrine has a different meaning than it has in Brazil. So take, for example, the importation of our political institutions. It is one of the most eloquent forms, one of the most important forms of mental colonialism. Our political institutions are on the whole copied from the United States specifically. So the Brazilian constitutional arrangements, although we've had many constitutions,
Right.
all the constitutions have been one or another version of American-style presidentialism.
Mm.
And the American-style presidentialism was designed by Madison
Right.
to fragment power in the state in many different sources,
Right.
but at the same time to slow politics down.
Right.
Uh,
Right. Right.
That's the Madisonian scheme of checks and balances.
That's
Now,
right.
But it was when in its initial formation, it was a proto-democratic liberalism. It was not a popular democracy. Many of the arrangements and schemes that were in the early constitution, some of which survived, others not, were designed to filter out popular influence and control demagogues. So avoid people like Huey Long, who we'll
Right.
discuss
Right.
later in the courts.
Right.
So imagine these arrangements, this republic of elites
Mhm.
imported into a society of radical inequalities. So what has happened is that the president is elected promising the sky to the masses, right? But then
Yes.
once in power, he finds himself with his hands tied.
Right.
Because Madison invented these arrangements to tie his hands. The whole
Right.
point was to inhibit the transformative uses of politics. So then we have this conflict between popular Caesarism, Huey
Right.
Long in power,
Yes.
constitutional arrangements designed to tie him hand and foot. So it's
Right.
as if the Madisonian scheme, once taken out of its natural context,
Right.
no longer suffices to control the popular demon.
Right.
And
Right.
that's then been one of the explanations of how the American presidential regime then turns out to mean something very different when transported to the Latin American context.
Right. Right.
It's not surprising then that the periodic dream of the Brazilian political elites is to institute some kind of parliamentary regime.
Mm.
Because every 4 or 5 years, the elites have this nightmare that through the mechanism of the presidential regime, an outsider will win power. And the way to avoid this nightmare is to end the presidential regime.
That's right.
But of
That's
course,
right.
but there would be other ways to do this, to
Yeah.
equip the presidential regime for mechanisms for the rapid resolution of impasse and so forth. But
Right.
it's just a reference to the role of mental colonialism in this experience of syncretism. Now, I
Right.
want to say the following. There are two main contexts for syncretism. One is racial,
Uh-huh.
the other is moral. And I think these are like the two chemical cabinets of humanity in history, because one are race differences, which
Uh-huh.
are much more patent than class differences.
Right.
They're marked on the human body.
Right.
And a huge percentage of the Brazilian population were African slaves
Right.
who continue to suffer all the consequences of slavery.
Right.
But our experience has been the opposite of the American racial experience, because the dominant phenomenon in Brazil is miscegenation, the
Right.
racial form of syncretism, the
Right.
mix of everything with everything else.
Right.
So the entire Brazilian population, at least above the South, the extreme South of Brazil, which is
Uh-huh.
pronounced European settlement, is some form of racial mixture.
Right. Right.
Everyone is a mixed race.
Right.
So even members of the elites.
Right.
So for example, me, I'm a member of the Brazilian elite. I was born in a political oligarchy, but I have a lot of black blood. I have a lot of Indian blood. And in those respects, I'm a typical Brazilian.
Right.
Of course, in
Right.
other respects, unfortunately, I'm not.
Right.
So I would be considered in the United States under the one drop rule, a black.
That's right. And that's part
A
of the
Latino or
profound,
what-
right. It's
Huh?
one of the profound differences between culturally and politically between Brazil and the United States, just
Yes,
what you
profound
described.
difference,
Yes,
profound difference.
profound.
So now, just to continue the story, to give it a further twist, the force of mental colonialism is so great that we have now imported from the United States the American racial policies into a world which is characterized by racial mixture. So we obviously have a problem of racial discrimination, because there is a profound association in Brazil between race and class.
Right.
we were beginning to develop an original Brazilian response to this problem, which had the following elements. It said, individualized racial discrimination will be criminalized. It will be treated as a crime. But the collective promotion of the disadvantage will always have a structural character, will be a structural response to a structural problem. And in that problem, race will never be separated from class.
Huh.
So we will take class as the predominant element because most poor Brazilians are both racially mixed and poor.
Right.
And that will be the basis for social promotion. But we'll
Right.
say, so what was the American importation? The American importation was like affirmative action.
Yes.
A
Yes.
quota. So we won't separate individual racial discrimination from the collective problem. We'll mix them together, and we'll
Right.
mix them together in the American way of treating race as a threshold problem that has to be dealt with before class
Right.
through affirmative action. Now, in the United States, the legal premise of the constitutionality and legality of affirmative action is that it's not a quota system.
Right. Right.
So the Supreme Court just invalidated it by saying it really is a quota system.
Right. Right.
But its defenders in the United States have to say it's not a quota system.
Right.
But
right.
in Brazil, it's openly described as a quota system, as the American quota system, which we have imported from the United States. So it's obviously preposterous because in a society in which everyone is of mixed race, you now have people self-declaring themselves as this or that in order to benefit from the quota, and it's
Right.
not solving any of our problems. So, and then the Americans have all the perverse consequences of their quota system, which generates benefits in inverse proportion to the need for them. So in other words, it benefits the Black professional and business class more than the Black working class, especially working class for local governments, firemen and policemen. And
Right.
least of all, it benefits the people who need the benefit most, who are the masses of poor Blacks who
Right.
fill the American prisons
Right.
and the secondary part of the American labor market. So then to take this system, which is already perverse in its effects for the United States, and introduce it into the reality of a mixed race society is a form of madness.
Yeah.
And it's an example of syncretism being taken off the rails by mental colonialism.
Right.
Huh?
And
Now-
when did this happen?
This
Brazil.
happened over the last few decades.
Okay.
And is actively promoted by American liberal progressive organizations who think that this is progress, to have American-style racial policies in Brazil. Now, the second main context of syncretism, I'm saying syncretism is the mixture of everything with everything else.
Right. Right.
Second main context is moral. So this is the second chemical cabinet of the history of humanity. There's race, the differences that are inscribed in the human body, these bodies that were chained, that were Black. And then there's the moral thing. And what are the moral elements from this chemical cabinet? There are exchange, system of exchange,
Right.
oppression, power, and affect, allegiance. So in traditional Brazilian society, the characteristic formula of a social relation between bosses and underlings, between men and women, between parents and children, is the mixture of these three elements of exchange, power, and affect in the same social relations. So the typical social relation of the traditional society is a sentimentalization of unequal exchange. The
Right.
extreme form of that is the ideology of slavery. We're one big happy family, but
Right.
it penetrates the whole society. And going back then to the evangelical Protestantism, in its moral and social consequences, the evangelical Protestantism is, among other things, a rebellion against that, because
Right.
it says, let's dissolve these three elements.
Right. Right.
Power is for the state, for democracy. Exchange is for the market. Affect
Right.
is for the family. We shouldn't try and pack these three things together in the same social relations.
Right.
And some of us think that these options are all wrong. That is, it's wrong what the evangelical Protestants do, and it's wrong what the traditional Brazilian society does. And we should have another dream,
Right.
which is to combine the Brazilian religion of vitality, of possibility, with tenderness.
Right.
Is one of the versions of the central contrast in our civilization of pagan greatness and Christian love.
Right.
And the
Right.
Brazilian dream is to have both of them in some form. So this is on this question of syncretism
Right.
and its moral and racial expressions.
Mhm.
Let me stop there and ask whether you'd like to comment on this, John, in the class.
It resonates profoundly. I have just a question in the degree to which, and that is the degree to which this new evangelicalism, is it as popular and significant as it is in the United States? And how
Absolutely. There are 50 or 60 million evangelicals, and their faith, unlike the faith of the majority of Catholics, is a living, burning faith. It's
Yes,
central to
yes,
their lives.
yes.
So it's not just that they have a different faith, it's that on the whole, their faith is much more incandescent than the faith of their Catholic fellow citizens.
Yes, yes.
But of course,
And-
the attitude of the Catholic majority in Brazil is more like the general attitude in the world, which is the sentimental attitude to religion, the sentimental will to believe. So an increasing part of humanity now would like to believe, right?
Right.
So they're stuck in some halfway house between belief and unbelief.
Right. Right.
And then the religion becomes a metaphor for moral verities. And
Yes.
what someone with deep religious convictions might say is that this halfway house between belief and unbelief is much worse than unbelief, because atheism is closer to faith than this stuff, right?
That's right. That's correct.
Because religion, like art, should be a storm that
Yes.
takes us somewhere in a direction that it should not be a way of dressing up the moral platitudes that we believe anyway.
Correct.
And that's what the religion of the majority tends to be, as opposed to the religion of the large evangelical minority.
That is,
So I'm not speaking diplomatically, of course, I'm speaking directly.
Yeah. So has, because of the huge rise of evangelicalism in Brazil, is Brazil approaching the United States, which, as I've mentioned, declined in its religiosity, the number of people saying they believe in God without doubting the existence of God or its equivalent, and those who attend religious services regularly?
Well, what confuses the issue is the idea of the Catholic majority, because the Catholic majority has this characteristically this half belief.
Yes, it does. Right.
They
So,
believe, but not too much.
so the evangelicals have not eclipsed Catholics in terms of
No,
number.
the Catholics are like what the asset holding class in the United States.
Yes.
Does it believe in anything? No, it believes in money, and it half believes in God, and neither believes nor disbelieves. So that's the position of the Catholic majority on the whole.
Yeah, yeah. And there are evidently few Catholics abandoning the Catholic Church and becoming evangelicals. That is,
Now let me say a word about the economic trajectory and the class structure of these societies. So let me begin with the United States. So at the end of the New Deal, in the period after the Second World War, right, John?
right.
Yeah, the focus shifted from the provision of antidotes to economic insecurity and the restabilization of the economy
Right.
to economic growth driven by mass consumption,
Mm-hmm.
by demand. And a great paradox of American life in the closing decades of the 20th century is that how could you have a style of growth based on mass consumption in a country that was undergoing a radical aggravation of inequality,
Right.
right? In the closing decades of the 20th century.
Right.
Because consumption-led growth requires the popularization of aggregate demand, of consumption, of purchasing power, and is incompatible with the radical aggravation of inequality. So the Americans squared this circle in part by the pseudo-democratization of credit, made possible in part by the overvaluation of the housing stock as collateral.
Right.
In the run-up to the financial and economic crisis of 2007, 2009.
Right.
So there's a kind of pseudo-credit democracy, which took the place of the idea of a property-owning democracy.
Right.
And which was the way in which this economic system was continued until its collapse in that crisis.
Right.
That was in turn facilitated by a feature of the world economy, which was that in those years, there was a connection between the import of capital surpluses and monetary surpluses from China by the United States. That is, the Chinese surpluses financed the American deficits.
Mm-hmm.
And the Americans used China as a way of evading a confrontation with their structural problems, how to reconcile growth with inequality.
Right.
You couldn't do that really without diminishing inequality, but they found a way to do it by importing these surpluses from China, trade surpluses and capital surpluses. The Chinese did the same thing on the other side. So China would need to reorient its pattern of economic growth from export-led growth to deepening of the internal market. But deepening of the internal market in China is not a mere accounting operation. It requires massive redistribution in China among sectors, among classes, and among regions. And such redistribution is necessarily conflictual. So the party was fearful, horrified by the conflictual dangers that would result from this reorientation of the economic order. The way to evade this confrontation was to export the surpluses to the United States. So each country used the structural imbalances in the world economy as a way of evading its confrontation with its structural problems internally. China and the United States, codependent, and their codependency was at that time the motor of growth in the world economy.
Right.
Now, there's another feature to highlight. The American economy was being progressively financialized.
Right.
And the successive layers of financial engineering were, of course, one of the elements in the background to the financial and economic crisis of 2007, 2008.
Right.
The nothing in the subsequent initiatives taken by the American state modified the relation between finance and production. In other words, the real way to make finance less dangerous is to make it more useful by deepening its connection to the productive system. But all of the measures taken did nothing to tighten these links between the productive agenda and finance.
Right.
Because you take what were the programs for the re-regulation of finance in the aftermath of the crisis? They were the reaffirmation of the New Deal idea of separating proprietary trading from federally insured banking
Right.
deposits.
Right.
That was the first program. The second program was enhancing the authority of the federal government to liquidate and restructure failing financial organizations. That was the new technocratic agenda.
Right.
Then there was the agenda of the international financial elite, headquartered in the Bank of International Settlements in Basel, to increase the requirements of capital adequacy of the banks. And there was the fourth project of consumer protection, the Consumer Protection Bureau of Financial Services.
Right.
If you take these four projects, none of them, nor all of them together, do anything to deepen the connections between finance and the productive system. The reality now continues to be the same that was before.
Right.
And the production system is largely self-financed on the basis of the retained and reinvested earnings of private firms.
Mm-hmm.
And the vast majority of financial activity makes no direct contribution to the expansion of output or the enhancement of productivity.
Yeah.
So there's this hypertrophy of finance in which it gobbles up more talent, more profit,
Mm-hmm.
a predatory relation to the system of production rather than the tightening of the relation. Well, that's the United States. So
Right.
it still hasn't solved its structural problems.
Right.
And there's this vacuum, and into the vacuum steps plutocratic populism, and now you know the rest of the story.
Right.
In which there continue to be non-structural responses to structural problems. And Brazil. So in Brazil, we had a vanguard of production. It was this industrial system, conventional industry that Vargas established in the mid-20th century.
Uh-huh.
And it is no longer the vanguard in the world. It's the vestige of an earlier vanguard or a satellite of the new vanguard of the knowledge economy.
Uh-huh.
And Brazil is one of the countries of the world that has deindustrialized most rapidly and most dramatically. So that whole industrial system that Vargas organized in the southeast of the country has begun to be subverted, deranged, sold off, is going under.
Oh.
And, how has Brazil avoided then total collapse? It's avoided total collapse by the way in which it's always avoided it, by its natural resources. The story that Vienna Moog tells about the earth of Brazil. So agriculture, mining, and ranching have paid the bill of urban consumption. So the rentier, the asset holding class are mainly financial rentiers.
Right.
They fail as producers, they continue to prosper as rentiers.
Uh-huh.
And the left-leaning government, I think it's a kind of pseudo-leftism, hands out transfer payments to the mass of poor Brazilians. So the asset-rich class gets 90%, the poor Brazilians get 10%. Everyone is more or less satisfied, and the country falls into the abyss, paid for by this easy natural wealth.
Right.
The expression of this is the profile of our trade with China. So
Right.
70 years ago, Brazilian GDP was greater than China's.
Oh.
Now it's a tiny fraction of China's. We put in ships untransformed soy and relatively untransformed iron ore. We send these ships to China, and the same ships brings us back all the products of the human mind. So this is a calamitous deal for our country, in
Yeah.
which disaster has been avoided only by this pseudo-medicine of the commodity wealth. That's the Brazilian side of the story. So you have these two great countries, the United States and Brazil.
Uh-huh.
Both of them have failed. The United States already being much richer, of course, and more powerful.
Right.
But they both failed to confront their structural problems by structural means.
Right.
And their social and economic life is the picture of this failure. So in the United States, there's a vanguard. There's a vanguard of the knowledge economy,
Right.
but it's a little ghetto. It's a
Right.
quarantine.
Right.
The vast majority, and around the titans of the knowledge economy, there are a host of service providers, the lawyers, the management consultants, the bankers who are pushing paper and making profits, and who are this sort of predatory, accessory, subordinate elite around the people who are the new vanguard, right? Everyone else in the United States is consigned to some form of make work,
Right.
including the small business class or the would-be small business class.
Right.
And that's the picture of the United States, which is in complete contradiction, I think, to the message of the American prophets that we
Right.
discussed yesterday, which is the message of the empowerment of the ordinary man and woman and their
Right.
rise to a high form of life. And in Brazil, they're paid off. The rich people are paid off with these financial rentiers, and
Yeah.
everyone else is paid off through the transfer programs, which avoid social collapse, and it's financed by the natural wealth, by the commodity.
Right.
That's a summary account without anesthesia of the situation of these two countries.
Which are, as you sketched out, quite similar. And if there's,
In some respects, with the obvious difference that the United States comes into this situation on the basis of a much higher level of power and development and
right.
so forth.
That's
So it has the luxury of waiting.
right.
We might think that we don't have this luxury, but we found a way to avoid facing the music, which
Right.
is this easy wealth of nature, replacing the difficult wealth of the human mind.
Right. Right.
So just a word about the class structure. The class structure of the contemporary societies around the world is very similar. There's on the top, there's a plutocracy,
Mhm.
very rich people. Then there's a business professional class. There's a small business class.
Mhm.
There's a working class with a white collar and blue collar segment.
Mhm.
General, the term middle class in the United States, I think, refers specifically to the small business class and to the white collar workers.
Right.
And the middle class in the American vocabulary is a worker with a bourgeois identity. So it's
That's correct. That's correct.
this class structure. And then there's a racially stigmatized underclass,
That's correct. That's
which
right.
in these two societies is largely the result of the slavery, which is
Yes.
part of the historical background.
Yes.
That's the situation. So let me now say a word about the particulars of the class structure in Brazil in three main segments. So first, the elites.
Right.
There's no knowledge economy to speak of. So we don't have any equivalent to the platform oligopolies of Silicon Valley.
Right.
We have these financial rentiers. Most of the Brazilian elite, most of the Brazilian rich people are, now that industry has collapsed, are financial rentiers of one kind or another.
Okay. Okay.
And there are two main exceptions or counterweights to the complete dominion of this financial elite. One are the big agribusiness international, because Brazil is together with the United States, one of the two largest agricultural exporters and producers in the world. So the Brazilian agribusiness is at the benchmark at the top of world efficiency, productivity.
Right.
And so the agro is a productivist world in its little sector, which is then a counterweight.
Right.
And there's a second counterweight, which I think is very interesting, which is the legal elite. So in Brazil, what happened, Brazil has 20% of all of the law schools in the world. So we have
Brazil has 20% of all the law schools.
20% of all the law schools in the world. So we have a whole major part of the population who are lawyers or pseudo lawyers, right?
And what is the percent in the United States?
It's much, much smaller, much smaller. But and what I think is interesting is that the elite, the legal elite, the elite part of this legal profession in Brazil is like the way Tocqueville describes the aristocracy in pre-revolutionary France.
Right.
That they are paid very high salaries by Brazilian standards.
Right.
The people who are judges, public prosecutors, attorneys. It's not like working for the DOJ where you
Right.
impoverished.
Yes.
They're paid very high salaries and they're treated like gold.
Yeah.
And they have a huge power, as you may have noticed in the papers,
Right.
because of the judicial activism, the power of the legal elite to put the politician in their place and so forth. So this is a complication in the life of the Brazilian elite. There's now this struggle between the financial rentiers on one side, then the agro, a world, a success at the frontier of productivity in the world,
Right.
and the legal elite, which is the counterweight at the elite level. Now you come to the second segment of the class structure, sort of the middle segment. Class, but middle segment. And you have then the following. There is alongside the traditional middle class, which in Brazil is oriented to the liberal professions and public employment and European culture. You have a new middle class. This second middle class is dark skinned. It's part of this racial mixture of the country. It comes from below. And its culture is a small business culture.
Okay.
It's a class of small scale entrepreneurs, hustlers, adventurers, self-made men and women, and so forth. It's either the objective petty bourgeoisie or the subjective petty bourgeoisie. Right. They have the ambition to become a small business class. And these are millions of people. Beneath this class, then, is a larger class of people who are still poor, but who are working desperately. People who hold 2 or 3 jobs, who wake up at 4 a.m. to go to the train station and take the additional job. And they are trying to join this petty bourgeois class. And we call them in Brazil batalhadores. They're the battlers, they're the combatants.
Okay, wow.
So
wow.
This is the second class.
Right.
And that's the middle. Now we come to the poor people. In the poor people, there is a fundamental division between 2 situations. In the periphery of the large Brazilian city, which is where most poor people live in Brazil now, about 2/3 of the families are destructured families. There's no man in the family. The family is a single mother with her children. The mother typically works in the secondary labor market and tries somehow to save the children, right? To care for them while they grow up. And the men rotate among women or among families,
Right.
these structured families. So the fundamental division is the division between where there is a structured family,
Uh-huh.
husband and a wife and children, and they are at least able to be skilled, and they're sort of with possible access to this social ascent. And the other part, the majority, in fact, which are these destructured families. And I mentioned this, and of course, this will require a completely different kind of social policy,
Right.
because for the destructured families, you need to provide a community support to bring them up to the level at which they could be skilled. Whereas
Right.
the other ones who are in the structured families have a much superior situation and are already on the escalator to join this petty bourgeoisie.
Right.
Right? And this is also related to the problem of violence, of crime experienced in Brazil, because
Compare with the United States.
and because it's something which is not understood clearly in Brazil. We have two kinds of crime, of course. We have organized crime.
Right.
We have episodic crime. The only crime that's widely spoken about in Brazil is organized crime,
Uh-huh.
because it's more showy. Huh?
Right.
Organized crime is an expression of the weakness of the state.
Right.
Organized crime proliferates when the state is weak or absent, and it assumes certain tasks of the state, quasi-statal functions, quasi-governmental functions, and that is one of the ways in which it becomes powerful, because it actually provides a service to these poor communities that the state fails to provide. It organizes them, it protects them, and so forth. And therefore, there has to be a war, a struggle between the state and the anti-state or the quasi-state.
Right.
Episodic crime is the predominant problem in Brazil, as in most societies. And economic and episodic crime, including violent crime, is a phenomenon of the weakness of society rather than of the weakness of the state. Episodic crime proliferates where society is disorganized.
Yeah.
So there are many societies that are almost as unequal and poorer than Brazil, like India, for example.
Right.
But the level of episodic violent crime at the grassroots is much smaller than in Brazil. And why? Because these societies are highly organized at the grassroots level, like India. Not necessarily organizations that we might like, caste organizations, religious organizations, but where there is organization, there is solidarity. And there is transparency. So people have their eyes open. They know what's happening around them. They feel responsible.
Right.
And a fundamental characteristic of Brazilian social life is that on the whole it is very disorganized at the grassroots level. So in most poor communities, the level of popular organization is very low or very selective. And so we would have to have a massive political initiative to organize civil society using the social programs of the state as a wedge, as an instrument to promote this self-organization of society outside the state. And in alliance with the attempt to give the petty bourgeoisie or the subjective petty bourgeoisie alternatives to its residual dream of archaic, isolated family business.
Right.
Now, where are we in time, John?
We have 35 minutes left.
Well, there's quite a lot there. I have one more thing to say, but let me stop there and ask for your comments on the class.
Yeah. So again, in terms of a comparison, is how would you compare crime in the United States with what you just detailed in Brazil?
Well, of course, Brazil and the United States are among the countries in the world with the largest levels of mass incarceration.
Right.
And the people who
Although
are
US is much higher per capita than Brazil.
and the people who are in the prisons are much like the same kinds of people. So
Right.
young Black males who are
Right.
involved in minor forms of drug trafficking are
Right.
a characteristic feature of the incarcerated population.
Right.
This is like the whole American fantasy of affirmative action. So it has nothing to do with the social reality, right? This is
Right.
this is the real stuff,
Right.
not this self-promoting fantasy of the elite of the society, which is co-opted, and separated from the rank and file.
Right.
But that's the real thing. And I think organized crime is less evident in the United States, though it's evident through the drug trafficking that comes from Central America.
Mhm.
There's the same problem that the organization is power. And the
Right.
self-organization of civil society outside the state is part of the solution to all the major social problems of the society.
Right.
The society has to be organized in order to empower itself. Then it can partner with the government,
Right.
both in productive uplift and in social uplift. But to do that, it has to be organized.
Interesting.
And among other things, the evangelical movement can be a mainstay of social organization. It has at least this potential,
Right. Similar to the United States.
similar to the United States.
Yes.
So, these things that I'm saying about these societies these are things which every citizen should know or everyone should be interested in. But I really think that these things are not widely understood. I have to say,
I
I'm
agree.
talking about them at an elementary level, but they're like the real stuff of social life, because
right.
the humanity is divided into these states, right? These armed states who are threatening each other.
Yes.
Different forms of life are developed under the shield of these armed states. So what is life in them like? And then we have to open it up. And here we are talking about Brazil in contrast to the United States. It's an example of what we would have to do comprehensively
That's
to
right.
understand our own time.
Right.
And it's like these problems are the problems of foreign countries. We're talking about them as if they were from Mars. And they're us.
That's right. That's right. That's hence the comparison of Brazil and the US is that they're the similarities with us.
Yes.
Yes. Which is a central theme. Although I'm still fascinated by the legal elite in Brazil of 20%.
Yes, I was saying the counterpart to Tocqueville's aristocrats under
Yes.
they have huge power. And I think it's a good thing for Brazil that they're paid very well.
Yes.
Just as it's a bad thing for the United States that the people at the DOJ are on famine budgets and
yes, that's right. That's
ridiculous.
right.
Why does a rich country
Yes.
the legal elite, which could be a counterpart to its plutocracy, a constraint on its plutocracy.
Yes.
Why does it starve them? Huh?
That's right. That's right.
Comprehensible.
Yeah, that's right.
Now, what about the class? Doesn't the class have opinions about this stuff?
Yeah, questions. Here's Myra.
Hi, thank you. I have a question about Professor Unger. You spent a bit of time talking about like these different sets in the middle class, like the new middle class, the poor that are working desperately, the poor whose difference is in family structure. And I was just wondering if these labels that you're using, is this more just academic speak, or are people in Brazil cognizant of the class that that they would belong to? Because
I haven't used fancy labels. I've spoken about, yeah,
Mhm.
I've used a common language, right? So
Mhm.
people have a vague, I think the labels wouldn't surprise anyone in Brazil. So uh, they're so the new middle class is described by the label emergentes, which
Mhm.
is a popular label. It's part of the popular language. The emergentes are the emerging, literally the emergent.
Mhm.
And they're emergent from the mass of the people through this culture of self-help and initiative. The batalhadores is another popular term. They're the combatants. They're the ones who show up at the train station at 4 a.m. and are holding different jobs. Everyone understands that. So I don't think there's anything arcane about that vocabulary. And the difference between the poor who have structured families and the poor who don't is also more or less obvious to anyone who knows these Brazilian cities and goes to see them. But of course, the elites don't know this. They don't travel to the periphery of the cities. They don't know what goes on there.
Mhm. Can I ask a quick follow-up? The other part of that question was, it sort of surprised me if the answer is that, this wouldn't surprise anyone in Brazil, because you also described Brazil as being
Now, it
profound.
would surprise certain people. It would certainly surprise the members of the Brazilian elite.
Okay.
Because to start with, they don't travel around their own cities. They don't know what happens around their walled mansions and condominiums. They have no idea.
Mhm. But for a member of these like emergentes or batalhadores, like
Uh,
something that I've often heard about Brazil is that precisely because of like the different racial awareness, for example, that there's names. There's like today we read like one of the readings was talking about shoot, I forget the name, like Mombisa or mulattoes, and like these different names for at every step of the
yes,
like of
of
the
all
racial
the
mixing process.
colorations, the mixtures
Yes.
of blacks and whites, but also whites and Indians, Indians and blacks, and so forth. Each of them has a different label.
Yeah,
In,
so my question was just like, it seems, at least when what you've described, at least amongst members of this class, that there is some sort of awareness of the class that they belong to. And I wouldn't necessarily, I don't feel like there's that same awareness in the United States. Like we lump everybody into middle class, and it's harder to distinguish amongst the different levels. So to me, like the fact that there does exist that sort of language would suggest like a certain awareness in Brazil that could suggest like a potential for organization. But you say Brazil is profoundly disorganized.
it is disorganized, but I mean, so, and I think that the social reality that I'm describing is not transparent to members of the elite. But it's also not like some big secret, right? Anyone who has his eyes open and travels around the Brazilian city and has a modicum of social curiosity could easily perceive this. So I don't think that in what I'm saying, there would be much of a surprise to any Brazilian, except that my language is undiplomatic, as I say. But aside from the fact that it's not careful and that I'm not paying homage to the sensitivities of the Brazilians, I don't think there's any big secret here. But I think that when you put it all together, it's astonishing, don't you think? I mean, it suggests not just this world of constraints, but a world of possibilities, of transformative opportunities. The main purpose of my description is not to suggest that this is a system from which we cannot escape. It's to suggest exactly the opposite, that it has many contradictions, many points of resistance, many ways in which the constraints can be turned into opportunities. So it's for anyone who has an intention to transform, anyone who has a critical or prophetic impulse, it's a dream. This is, what more can you ask of the world? than it provide us with such contradictions.
Thank you.
Other questions? Yeah, Rio?
Oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
Okay. Sort of on that note, I was wondering if you could touch on like any models for how to reduce deforestation when this is such a structural part of the economy.
No,
But-
I don't think it's a structural part of the economy. I think it's so.
What-
Well, let's talk about the Amazon. So the Amazon, of course, is huge. And there are two different Amazons. There's the forested Amazon and there's the subtropical savanna, the Cerrado. The baseline problem in the Amazon is land chaos, right? No one knows who has what. Less than 4% of the land in private hands has clear legal title. And if you don't know who owns what, then pillage will always be more attractive than either preservation or production. So you have to solve the land chaos. You have to give clear legal title to the people who are working there. The families who have been there are most of them there for 3 or 4 generations. And it's absurd to treat them as land grabbers because they're small scale producers. Now, so that's the preliminary problem, is to organize that land chaos. Then you have the following dilemma, which is at the center of the problems of the Amazon. What does sustainable development of the Amazon mean? It must mean one of two things. Either it means a primitive extractivist industry without science, without technology, without scale, and therefore without a future, or it means a version of the knowledge economy. In other words, it's either primitive or it's highly advanced. There's nothing in the middle. And so if it's going to be highly advanced, we need the help of the whole world, scientifically and technologically, to organize it. And we need to organize these links between the productive vanguard in the cities and the forested areas behind. But we need to connect the green complex to the urban industrial complex. And even with things that are very basic, I think, for example, it's not commonly appreciated that almost all the forest technology that evolved in the world evolved to deal with homogeneous temperate forests. That's the technology that's used in Canada and Finland and the United States and so forth, and not to deal with heterogeneous tropical forests. So even the basic technology doesn't exist. We have to develop it. We can't develop it alone. We have to develop it in alliance with scientists and inventors around the world who are fascinated by the Amazon. So this is a vast national project because the Amazon is the biggest reservoir of sweet water in the world. It has 40% of the water in the world, the biggest reservoir of biodiversity in the world. We have to be stewards of that and developers of that in the interest of humanity. And we need help to do that. But it's clear what the general direction has to be. The general direction has to be to organize a vanguardist, sustainable development as the alternative to this primitive artisanal extractivism, which preservationists are constantly promoting, but which has no future and no viability.
Gordon, you have a question.
Yes, just following up on sort of like, this conversation about the Amazon. I'm curious sort of how we should think about any international effort to sort of like preserve the Amazon and its like natural diversity, and specifically American effort. I mean, the United States, given the history of the United States and colonialism in South and Latin America, going back to the Monroe Doctrine.
Yeah, Brazil looks with this with great suspicion and resistance, of course, because the foreign NGOs, especially the American NGOs, are generally viewed as fronting for businesses and foreign governments. And I think the Brazilians think that their attitude is simply preservationist and not developmentalist. And so that's the explanation of the resistance. Brazil will insist on its sovereignty over the Amazon, but I think we all understand that the sovereignty has to be exercised in the interest of humanity. And that's why we need help for the development of this vanguardist project in the Amazon. The trouble is that many of these NGOs would basically seem to want the Amazon to be a big park for the benefit of humanity, right? Where nothing happens. And that's not going to take place. It's 2/3 of our national territory. 25 million people live and work there. So it's not going to be a park. It's like saying, well, United States west of the Mississippi should be transformed into a great national park for the benefit of humanity. Is that going to happen? No, it's not going to happen.
Yeah.
Germany says, no, we have to have this too. But in Germany, the only trees that are left are basically the trees in the Tiergarten in Berlin. So it's hard to take that seriously. The fact is that we have preserved close to 90% of the Amazon remains virgin forest. So most of it has been preserved despite all of these fires and slashing and burning there. And now there has to be this struggle to form an alternative. So some of the Brazilian governments, of course, want to placate foreigners and use this purely preservationist or park-like discourse, but it doesn't have a future in Brazil. If the population of the Amazon doesn't have productivist alternatives that can be reconciled with sustainable development, that population will inevitably be driven into activities that are destructive of the forest. And now there's a false solution there, which is in the free zone of Manaus. Manaus is the largest city in the Amazon proper. It's the capital of the state of Amazonas. We have a kind of industrial park which puts together cell phones and motorcycles. Has nothing to do with the Amazon. So it could be in Hong Kong. It could be in Southeast China. The only preservationist function that it has is that it employs the urban population of the Amazon, which might otherwise do mischievous things in the forested areas. But that's not the solution. The solution is to organize an organic connection between the urban complex and the green complex and all the intermediate links that are necessary to have this project of sustainable development. It can't be just a slogan. You have to open the black box and ask, what is the content?
Great. Amitha, you have your hand up?
Yes, Professor. So my question, Professor Unger, was you mentioned that Brazil's economy is now using more of natural resources at the cost of developing their own other ways of economic resources. In the sense
It's using its easy natural wealth
as
a substitute for the hard intellectual wealth.
Yes. So that's quite sad. I was just wondering whether there is any intention to, or is there any potential to shift to any other forms of development?
But it depends on all the institutional and educational reforms in our country. So, for example, Brazilian education remained marked by an emphasis on memorization in the encyclopedia. So historically, our model of education has been France. So it's as if the object of the school in Brazil is to transform a 21st century young Brazilian into a 19th century French child. It's like a war that we wage against ourselves, because our culture is syncretistic, as I said, anarchic. There's this anarchic creativity. So instead of putting a straitjacket on the anarchy, let's purify it. Let's equip it. Let's not try and transform us into the opposite of us. So that's an example of something which is not like these economic debates that I've been mentioning in this discourse, but it's part of this picture. But this is if you take everything together, it's a project of national liberation, and it demands a vision and talents which are beyond the talents of the politician. You have to be a prophet too. You have to be like the people we discussed last week.
Right.
Okay, thank you, Professor.
Other questions? I have a question for you, Roberto, Professor Unger. You mentioned the emergentes, the emergent.
Yes,
emergent.
Emergent.
Emergent through self-help.
Yes.
And from what you were describing, there seems to be a fairly robust self-help industry in Brazil, or the people turn to self-help. And in the United States, I mean, that's famous. I mean, the most popular books over the past 100 years have been self-help books. And is that, to what degree is the notion of self-help?
Many of the purveyors of self-help in Brazil, as in the United States, are shady, right?
Right.
It's a business too, right?
And have long been shady,
So that's all part of this confusion. I mean, there's a mixture of prophets and bandits, and
yes.
And no respectable member of the Brazilian elite would have anything to do with that world.
That's true, which is actually true in the United States. Yes. Would you say, I mean, it sounds like it's robust, it's very popular.
It is very popular, but there are all these forms of exploitation.
Right.
As
in the United States,
many of the churches exploit their faithful.
Right, as in the United States.
The dizimo, the 10th, which is paid to them. And it's a money-making operation.
Yes.
The founder of one of these churches was previously a public functioning in the lotteries, in the lottery business of the state. And then he transferred from the public lotteries to the religion.
Right.
So there's all of this stuff that goes on.
Yes.
But it's with these cards that we have to play this game.
Right.
And not with the hand of cards that we would like to be dealt.
Right.
But with the cards with which we are dealt.
That's right. That's right. That's very good.
I actually have one more thing to say, which
okay, go ahead.
Stop, which is the final step of this remarks is about this question of coldness, which we discussed before. So going back to the idea of the sentimentalization of unequal exchange, which is the formula of traditional social relations in Brazil. The fact is that it provided a certain kind of warmth, right? And one of the characteristics of these traditional societies, including, of course, Brazil, is that this mixture of exchange, power, and affect was an antidote to coldness. So these societies of the North Atlantic world, like the United States, when they disassemble the combination of exchange, power, and become cold.
Right.
So when they become freer, they become colder.
Right.
This was, again, the image which I mentioned before, Schopenhauer's porcupines, right?
Right.
Humanity like Schopenhauer in the cold night. They
Right.
huddle together to warm one another,
Right.
and then they prick one another with their spines, or
Right.
they go apart, or they move back and forth and settle into an uncomfortable middle distance. No?
Right. Right.
We see the Americans as being in that middle distance. No?
Yeah.
They become freer, but they become colder. We don't want to become cold. Huh? So the question is, how can we become free without becoming cold? And what is the alternative source of warmth? Because in this process, which Max Weber and others described as rationalization or disenchantment,
Right.
as you become freer, you become colder. It seems to be just one thing seems to be the reverse side of the other.
Right.
And so the source of warmth in these traditional or hierarchical societies has been some emanation of the warmth of family life.
Right.
And that's why the ideology of slavery was, we're one big happy family.
Right.
So we have to find another source of warmth in the world. And I think that another candidate for the source of warmth is the imagination.
Yes.
Because the creation of alternatives in the world should be a source of warmth, creative energy
Right.
among strangers. And the political and economic institutions
Right.
as vehicles for the creation of energy,
Right.
of this warmth that results from invention, from
Right.
excitement, from the euphoria of discovery and invention. That's the better source of warmth, and that's what I would like for my country.
Right.
And that's what I would think the Americans should want for themselves.
That's right. That's right.
And said they have political institutions that don't need crisis to produce change, but that facilitate the creation of alternatives. They have economic institutions like an inclusive experimental knowledge economy.
Right.
That make innovation perpetual, the perpetual creation of the new. That's where we should want warmth to come from.
Right. Right.
And so and I think that's related to what I would regard as the essential dream of a society like Brazil. That our greatest national attribute is our vitality, right? And I think that's also the greatest similarity between the United States and Brazil, that they're both societies with enormous vitality, of movement, effervescence, a brainy motion that comes from below. The people are constantly inventing things and discovering things and changing things. And it's that vitality that has to be lifted up. A German poet, Friedrich Hölderlin, said, "He who thinks most deeply loves what is most alive." So that's the base. Vitality is the basis of a sustained and magnanimous empathy. That's the basis of warmth.
Yes.
And it's for that we need institutions. So I think the Brazilian dream, which is a variant on this Western theme of reconciling Christian love with pagan greatness, is how can we have exuberance, an extravagant, exuberant society, prodigal in forms of syncretism and invention, mixture of everything with everything else. How can we have that, but while giving softness to human relations, to the direct relations of people? So foreigners who come to Brazil often say, everyone there is charming. And I have to say that that's a problem for me, because I always say in Brazil, when I'm there, I feel like a man without charm in a country of charmers. But in Brazil, everyone is charming, everyone else is charming. And how do we create the institutional and cultural basis for this seduction, for this charm, so that we can avoid the fate of the modern societies of becoming colder when we become freer?
Yes. Yes.
And that's what I would regard as a supreme objective.
Yes.
in-
Both
in-
for Brazil and the United States. Yeah. And I would say that that sense, that exuberance, and that the exuberance is connected to imagination.
Absolutely, because this is what I believe. I think that the vitality is the most important attribute.
Yes.
Vitality requires an ally, and the ally of vitality is the imagination.
That's right. That's right. That's right.
Product of the marriage of vitality and the imagination is great.
Right. Yes.
Is
Yes.
a higher life.
That's
for the
right.
human, and
That's
that's
right.
what the prophets of democracy propose.
That's right.
That's
And they
really-
they fuel each other. The vitality fuels imagination. Imagination fuels the vitality. It's a
Exactly.
twinning, a beautiful pairing.
So, John, I think I have attempted to discharge my mission.
That is, you did a brilliant job, Roberto, as always.
In relation to the United States. And I don't think we had enough a chance to discuss here. But I hope that we'll find ways to continue this conversation.
I do too. I do too. Actually, end with one somewhat humorous anecdote from Moog. He describes, so he's writing, he writes his book in 1950s, and then the paperback comes, or it's translated, the English edition is in 1964. So we assigned some of the English editions, and he says, this is one of his many throwaway lines: Americans are far more propitious to material progress, but Moog finds serious flaws in it. And he symbolizes these flaws by using Walt Disney's Pluto and Donald Duck. The pup, meaning Pluto, signifies our immature idealism and the frustration it brings. Donald Duck, probably a Republican, represents the hardworking, active, clean-cut, dynamic, energetic, resourceful American. And why does he fail? Because in the American tradition, he subordinates all other values to the exaltation of strenuous activity and accomplishment. If Donald stopped to reflect, he would see that in the US, the myth of the infinite possibilities of the individual in the world of free competition has ceased to be operational.
Very good.
Thank you, Roberto.
You all.
We'll see you all next week, hopefully in person.
Next week. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.